Corporate Moral Agency, Peter A. French. There are two versions or two notions of the nature of corporations. In Chapter 8, we're looking at two competing claims about how we ought to view corporations when we're looking at them from both a legal and a moral standpoint. What Peter French is doing is asking the question, are corporations persons? So in other words, can we treat corporations, or should we view corporations, as simply another type of person, and then ask ourselves what sort of moral standard or standards should that person be held to? In his article, as he says right up front, I shall argue that corporations should be treated as full-fledged moral persons, and hence that they can have whatever privileges, rights, and duties as are, in the normal course of affairs, accorded moral persons. So French is making a very bold claim here. What he's saying is that corporations are persons in all the sort of requisite ways. In other words, corporations can have rights. There can be free speech attributed to corporations. There's due process attributed to corporations. Now, when you say the corporation has rights or privileges or duties, what French is saying is not that some individual in the corporation has those privileges, rights, or duties, but the corporation as a whole. So it's creating a fictional person. So it's fictional in the sense that there's no one living, breathing individual that represents the corporation. In that sense, it's fictional. But this fiction, this construct, is actually a thing that needs to be taken into account. So the corporation, however we conceive of that abstractly, actually can have their rights or privileges and duties. And these things are then to be protected in society or required of the corporation. But French has to make the case for that, because this is, of course, an odd sort of person. A person that doesn't look like you and I, we normally don't attribute rights to. So French has got to make the case that we should view corporations as persons in this sense. Two types of responsibility ascription. In order to make the case that corporations should be treated as persons, French believes he needs to make the case that corporations can be ascribed responsibility for their actions. In fact, what French wants to argue is that corporations can have intentions or intentionality. That is, they can intend to do things and actually go through with those things, and we can ascribe responsibility for those actions. Now, there's two types of responsibility ascription. There's the whodunit, which simply pins responsibility to someone or something. The other question is, or the other type of responsibility, is accountability, having a liability to answer for. So we can say of someone, well, this person actually did an action, and we might look at this in the context of the corporation. Corporate manager X did action Y. That doesn't mean that we will hold that individual accountable. We could say, well, they're responsible for the action that happened or the outcome. But it might be that the accountability, who has the liability to answer, is not the individual. And what French wants to do is corporations have accountability in the second sense. So liability or obligation is based upon a pre-existing relationship. Responsibility description is properly uttered by someone Z if he, she can hold X accountable for what he or she has done. Again, this is right from 265. It's basically giving you a breakdown of what we mean by accountability. Who has a liability to answer? I can ascribe responsibility to someone Z if she can hold X accountable for what he or she has done. Creation of responsibility relationships, contracts, promises, hirings, assignments, appointments, or agreeing to enter a role's original position are all ways in which we can create responsibility. So in the case of the corporation and that individual manager, if an individual manager performs an action, it might be that the reason why the corporation can be considered the agent that's held accountable is because of the contracts, the promise, or the hiring of that individual. So liability might shield the individual, but the corporation, quote unquote, whatever that sort of thing is actually the thing we're going to hold accountable. And there are all these number of ways in which responsibility can be created. Accountability relationships of type 2. As I mentioned in the previous slide, what French wants to do is say that corporations can be held accountable in that second sense, or responsible in the second sense, that is accountable, having a liability to answer. How do we have accountability relationships? Well, when we have an accountability relationship, we normally hold one that the person held accountable is causally responsible for particular actions. So when you say, I'm going to hold you accountable for the auto fender bender we had, it's usually the case that I can say that the person is accountable because they caused the accident. The person's actions or action was intended. So another way in which we have accountability is if one intends to do something. Normally we don't hold people to the same level of accountability if their actions or if they did not intend to cause harm to someone else. Thus the notion of an accident. While we may say that they actually did it, they're responsible in some sense in the whodunit sort of way, it's not always the case that we look at them as accountable in the same way when the action wasn't intended. And that intention is going to play a big role for French in holding corporations as persons. Event was directly caused by an intentional act of the subject. So a person's actions were intended. Event was directly caused by an intentional act. So it might be the case that there was a general intention or a very specific intention. This is exactly what subject X wanted to do. For a corporation to be held accountable, it must be the case that a corporation can be viewed as performing intentional acts. That is, acts independent of the actions of some discernible individual or group of individuals. Now this point is extremely important in making the case for the corporation as person. If I can reduce a corporate decision down to the act of an individual or a group of individuals, then I can't actually say that the corporation acted in any sense. Because I can simply point to the individual within the corporation and said, this individual's actions were intended. This event was directly caused by the intentional act of some subject, and so forth. So what French needs to do is show that corporations can act independently of individuals, a single individual or groups of individuals within the corporation. And so that's going to be the basis for his argument of corporations as persons, namely that we can in fact point to ways in which corporations act independently of their individual members. Corporate Internal Decision Structure, or the CID structure. So how can I hold a corporation as a person, or view a corporation as a person? That is, as a thing that acts independently of the members that make it up. After all, corporations aren't persons. Corporations don't breathe. Corporations don't die, at least not in the sense of a human death or biological death. You can't kick a corporation. You can't assault a corporation the way you can assault other individuals. So there's only a sense in which it's metaphorically I do these things. But how can I actually hold a corporation as a rights bearer, as someone that acts? Well, according to French, it's the corporate internal decision structure that forms the basis of this person that he's talking about. So what is a CID structure? Well, it's an organizational or responsibility flowchart that delineates stations and levels within the corporate power structure. Corporate decision recognition rules are also part of this structure, corporate policy, for instance. And when two components work together, they constitute a synthesis of various decision-making sections of the corporation. So we can think of it sort of as the blueprint of the corporation. First, there's a general structure to all corporations. There's a board of directors, there's a president, there's a CEO, there's a CFO, there are managers, middle managers, all the way down to the people who clean the buildings. And all of this is on a flowchart. Who's responsible to whom? Any number of these individuals may have different intentions. They may write reports, give suggestions, send memos around, and so forth. All of that's part of a structure, and there's a chain of command and so forth that goes on within the company. There are also corporate decision recognition rules, that is, the corporate policies. And those corporate policies function together to form, with the organizational chart, to form the corporation. Now, there's one way we can look at this is to think of our own brain. If we think about how our brain, in fact, in relation to our body even, is organized, we can say that in the brain there are individual neurons. Those individual neurons fire, but no thought is one individual neuron firing. It's only when we put together the ways in which the neurons are connected, the sort of organization of these paths, along with the ways in which this chemical exchange operates, the sort of recognition rules, when we put those all together, that's where we seem to get our consciousness. We can't boil down individuals into this neuron firing or that neuron firing. And so what French has is a similar idea with corporations. Given the way they're organized, and it's a formal sort of organizational flowchart, along with the decision recognition rules, what French says is when all of those things work together, we get, in essence, a person and a corporate act. And that act is not reducible down to any one piece of the puzzle, any more than a thought is reducible down to any single neuron firing in our brain. CID structure and biological persons. As you can see, the CID structure, along with sort of corporate policy, is making up the framework for this artificial person. According to French, the CID structure incorporates the acts of biological persons. So it's components. So what are these people? If a corporate action is not reducible to an individual, but we all know that corporations are or contain individuals within them, then what are these? Well, these are essentially the pieces. They're the components that make up the corporation, much like we can look at the chips and things that make up a computer. But those things individually, again, no individual piece of the computer makes up the computer. The central processing unit is nothing without the memory, and the memory won't have anything in it unless we've got a program running, and so you need the drive to load the programs and so forth and so on. So the CID structure essentially incorporates these persons and then organizes how they act. So given any event E, this event can be described in two non-identical ways. And what French says is we can say executive X is doing Y. So some executive makes a decision, puts forth some sort of policy. That's one way in which an event can occur. Or we can view it as corporation C is doing Z. And what French says, these are mutually exclusive. This event can be described either as an executive doing an action or as a corporation doing an action. And as long as we can go with number two, as long as we can say that a corporation has done something, that we can describe the act that way, then we can hold that corporations are persons, that our corporations are things that have acted intentionally. CID structure, the chess analogy. Although I've given a few examples of how a CID structure is analogous to other sorts of things, like the brain or perhaps a computer, French presents his view conceptually in the form of the chess analogy. He says we can think of the CID structure as consisting of grammar and logic. The grammar is the distinct pieces in a chess. So we have the king, queen, rook, bishop, knight, and pawn. The logic is the way in which each piece is permitted to move, or the rules of the game. So when we look at a chess game as a whole, we don't look at the chess game as any individual move. So it's not when the queen took the opponent's pawn or bishop. But we look at the game, quote unquote, the entire game, as all of these moves working together. So it's the king, queen, rook, and bishop and knight. Those are the grammar, the organization, along with the logic, the ways in which they're permitted to act. And when we put all that together, we get the chess game. And so French just presents this as a way of conceptualizing the notion of a corporation acting independently of its members. Recognition rules. So how is it that we recognize a corporate act as something distinct from the actions of an individual or group of individuals? Well, according to French, what we need to look at are the recognition rules. In other words, we look to the procedures in which a decision is recognized internally within a corporation. Now, recognition rules, or what French means by recognition rules, are actually taken from another legal philosopher, actually, H.L.A. Hart. And if you notice in the textbook, this is footnote number 7, by recognition rules, I mean what Hart in another context calls conclusive affirmative indication that a decision on an act has been made or performed for corporate reasons. So a recognition rule is simply that. It's the recognition that an act has actually occurred. Now, recognition rules are partially defined by the procedural rules. So when you have the CID structure with this sort of organizational chart, the ways in which those different parts of the organizational chart are to interact is sort of set up. So part of recognizing a decision is going to come from that. Recognition rules are also a function of the type of policy it instantiates. So a recognition rule, or the recognition that a corporation has acted, might be because we've come up with a new policy within the corporation. And the fact that a new policy has been instantiated shows that, or allows us to recognize that a corporation has done something. So a corporate decision, and this is quoting directly from the text, is recognized internally not only by the procedures of its making, that sort of organizational chart, but by the policy it instantiates. Hence, every corporation creates an image, which is not to be confused with its public image, or general policy, what G.C. Busby of the Chilton Company has called the basic belief of the corporation. And as an example, if you want a sort of more concrete example of this, look on page 267, where they talk about the actions of Gulf Oil Company and the individuals X, Y, and Z, and whether or not we can look at the company as making a decision, or the individuals. And French essentially makes the argument there that in the Gulf Oil case, we could make the case that it was Gulf Oil making the decision. So within this complex structure, as each group sort of gives its opinion, comes to its decisions, follows the rules of procedure, follows the sort of flow chart of how the organization works, at some point a policy is instantiated, a decision is made, and there's a way we can now recognize corporate intentionality, that a corporation has done something. Corporate intentionality. So now, having established all of these things, the notion of accountability to be held liable, and this accountability is based on the idea that some action was intended, or there was some intentionality behind an action, and the fact that we can now hold corporations as individuals because we can sort of remove from the corporation the actions of individuals, or at least integrate all of those individuals into one corporate whole. So, when the corporate act is consistent with the implementation of established corporate policy, then it is proper to describe it as having been done for corporate reasons, as having been caused by a corporate desire coupled with a corporate belief, and so, in other words, as corporate intentional. So when all of these things to work together, and when a decision comes out that's consistent with those flow charts, those procedures, and those policies of the corporation, then we can ascribe intentionality to the corporation. So corporate decisions are in many respects independent of the individual decision makers or the intentions of individual decision makers. Because notice, when all of these things work together, even if there are some people intending certain things, whether by putting reports or giving suggestions or ideas, all of these things go through a process in which those individual intentions are subsumed under the whole of the corporation. So we can say, in fact, that a corporation has intended. This also allows the possibility that certain individual acts or actions may not be consistent with the corporate CID structure and corporate policy. And in such cases, then, we can separate the actions of the parts from the corporate whole. So we can say Corporation X did nothing wrong in this particular case because individual Y acted against corporate policy and established corporate procedure. And so it's one way of divorcing an individual act from the corporate act. Now, this can be, of course, be difficult because we have to know exactly what the corporate policy is, the structure is, and so forth, and try to figure out what the corporation actually intended. But at least conceptually, we can theoretically divorce the individual actions from the corporate action. But as long as these are consistent, as long as the corporate policy, internal policies as well as the ones that publicly are made, as long as these things are consistent, we can say that a corporation has acted or has intended to do something, says French. And thus, given that we can attribute intentionality to corporations, we ought to also attribute to them rights, duties, and obligations.